He thought losing the ability to walk normally was the worst thing that could happen to him. He was wrong. Adrian Park stared at the diamond engagement ring resting on the white hospital blanket across his lap. Just 10 minutes earlier, it had been on Victoria Sinclair's finger. 10 minutes earlier, he had still believed that love could survive anything. Outside the large hospital window, rain slid down the glass in slow silver streams, blurring the lights of downtown Seattle into a watercolor of gold and gray. The room smelled faintly of antiseptic, fresh linen, and the flowers that wealthy friends had sent but never personally delivered. Machines hummed quietly in the background. Somewhere down the hallway, a nurse laughed softly before disappearing around a corner. Life continued moving forward. Adrian's did not. Victoria stood near the doorway with her designer handbag hanging from one shoulder. Her makeup was flawless. Her cream-colored coat looked untouched by the storm outside. She looked exactly the same as she had before the accident. Adrian envied that. The accident had left a jagged scar along the side of his face. Months of surgeries had reduced the damage, but the mirror still showed a stranger staring back at him. His left leg would require years of therapy. Some doctors weren't even sure he would ever regain full mobility. For the first time in his adult life, Adrian Park could not control the future. Victoria's eyes lowered toward the ring. Her expression carried neither cruelty nor sadness, only distance. "I can't do this anymore, Adrian," she said quietly. "I didn't sign up for this life." The words settled into the room like cold winter air. Adrian said nothing. The silence stretched between them. A year ago, politicians had competed for invitations to their wedding. Business leaders had fought for seats at their reception. Magazines had called them the city's most powerful couple. Now there was only silence. Victoria carefully removed the engagement ring and placed it on the blanket. The diamonds sparkled beneath the fluorescent lights. "I'm sorry," she whispered, but her voice sounded rehearsed, like a line she had practiced during the drive. To the hospital. Adrian looked at the ring. Not at her. Not because he was angry. Because if he looked into her eyes, he might still ask her to stay. The storm tapped gently against the glass. Victoria waited a few seconds. Then she turned and walked away. The soft click of the closing door echoed through the room. Adrian remained perfectly still. He listened to the fading sound of her heels moving down the hallway until even that disappeared. For several moments, the room felt impossibly large. Empty. Heavy. The man who controlled one of the most powerful criminal organizations on the West Coast sat alone beneath fluorescent lights, staring at a ring he could no longer give away. His hand slowly reached toward it. His fingers trembled. Not from pain. Not from weakness. From the realization that the accident had taken more than his health. It had revealed something far worse. Everyone had admired Adrian Park when he stood tall. But now, as rain streaked across the darkening sky beyond the window, he was finally discovering who would remain when he could no longer stand at all. 3 months later, the curtains in Adrian Park's bedroom had not been opened once. Dust gathered along the edges of the massive floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Puget Sound, turning million-dollar views into little more than pale gray shadows. Morning and night no longer felt different inside the mansion. The room remained dim, silent, and frozen in time. The grandfather clock in the hallway continued marking every passing hour, but Adrian stopped paying attention weeks ago. Days blended together until even he could not remember whether it was Monday or Thursday. The mansion itself seemed to reflect its owner's condition. Staff members moved quietly through the hallways. Conversations ended whenever Adrian's wheelchair appeared around a corner. The once lively estate felt more like an abandoned museum than the headquarters of one of the most powerful organizations on the West Coast. Adrian preferred it that way. Visitors stopped asking to see him. Business partners stopped requesting meetings. Even family members learned not to insist. Every excuse sounded the same. He was recovering. He needed rest. He was focusing on his health. The truth was much simpler. Adrian no longer wanted the world to see what he had become. On a cold October afternoon, rain tapped softly against the windows as Adrian sat alone in his study. The room smelled faintly of old leather, coffee gone cold, and untouched books. A framed photograph rested face down on the desk. He had turned it over weeks ago, but never removed it. Some habits were harder to break than others. A stack of reports sat neatly organized beside him. Financial summaries, property updates, investment reports. documents that once demanded his full attention. Now they remained unopened. His gaze drifted toward the reflection in the dark window. The scar along his face caught the faint light from a nearby lamp. Instinctively, he looked away. A knock interrupted the silence. Adrian did not respond. The door opened anyway. His longtime assistant, Daniel Mercer, stepped inside carrying a folder. Daniel had worked beside Adrian for nearly 8 years. He was one of the few people still willing to speak honestly. "The board meeting starts in 20 minutes, Daniel said carefully. Adrian stared out the window. "Then they should begin without me." Daniel sighed. "This is the 4th time. Then they know the routine." Silence settled between them. Rain continued tapping against the glass. Finally, Daniel placed the folder on the desk. "People are starting to worry." Adrian let out a quiet laugh. It contained no humor. "That is generous of them." Daniel hesitated. "You built everything they are trying to protect." Adrian's jaw tightened. Once, those words would have mattered. Once, responsibility had been enough to pull him forward. But responsibility could not erase loneliness. It could not fill an empty room. It could not make someone stay. After a moment, Daniel turned toward the door. "For what it is worth," he said quietly, "the people who matter are still here." Adrian did not answer. The door closed softly behind him. The room fell silent once more. Across the desk sat a small velvet box. He had never thrown it away. Never opened it either. It simply remained there, like a monument to a future that no longer existed. Outside, the storm clouds thickened over the water. Inside, Adrian sat motionless as darkness slowly filled the room. And for the first time in his life, the man who once controlled every outcome could not imagine a single reason to move forward. The morning Simone Brooks arrived at the mansion, she almost turned her car around twice. The GPS insisted she had reached the correct address, but nothing about the place felt real. The estate stretched across several acres overlooking the water, hidden behind iron gates and rows of towering evergreen trees. Even after years of working private housekeeping jobs throughout Washington, Simone had never seen anything like it. She parked her 10-year-old Honda Civic beside a row of luxury vehicles that probably cost more than every paycheck she had earned in the last decade combined. Pulling her coat tighter against the cold November wind, she stepped out and stared up at the enormous stone mansion. The sky hung low and gray overhead. Rain threatened, but had not yet begun to fall. Simone took a slow breath and reminded herself why she was there. The temporary agency had offered double her usual rate. Her rent was due in 2 weeks. Her younger brother needed help covering community college tuition. Turning down the job had never really been an option. The front door opened before she could knock. A sharply dressed woman in her 60s greeted her with a professional smile. "You must be Simone." "Yes, ma'am. I am Evelyn, house manager." "Come inside." Warm air greeted her as she entered. The scent of polished wood and fresh coffee drifted through the foyer. Crystal chandeliers reflected soft light across marble floors. Everything looked immaculate, yet strangely lifeless. Beautiful but empty. Evelyn handed her a folder containing schedules, room assignments, and staff guidelines. "Your responsibilities are straightforward," she explained while leading Simone down a long hallway. "Guest rooms, east wing cleaning, and occasional assistance in the library. Most importantly, you stay professional." Simone nodded. "Of course." Evelyn hesitated for a moment. The owner values privacy. Something about the way she said it caught Simone's attention. Not fear exactly. Caution. "Will I be meeting him?" Simone asked. "Probably not." The answer came quickly. "And if you do, keep interactions brief." Simone simply nodded again. She had worked for wealthy clients before. Some liked conversation. Others preferred invisibility. Neither bothered her. As they continued through the mansion, Simone noticed something unusual. Despite the size of the property, very few people seemed to be talking. Employees moved quietly. Doors opened and closed with careful restraint. The entire house felt as though it were holding its breath. Later that afternoon, while dusting shelves in the library, Simone paused beside a large window overlooking the water. The view was breathtaking. Gray waves rolled gently beneath cloudy skies. Seagulls drifted above the shoreline. It should have felt peaceful. Instead, the room carried an unmistakable sadness. Her eyes landed on a wheelchair parked near the fireplace. She immediately looked away, feeling guilty for noticing. The agency had mentioned that the homeowner was recovering from an accident. Nothing more. Simone respected that. People deserve privacy during difficult times. As she resumed working, she heard the faint sound of movement somewhere above. Slow, measured, followed by silence. For a brief moment, she glanced toward the staircase. She saw nothing. No face. No figure. Only shadows stretching across the upper hallway. Without realizing it, she smiled softly. Whoever lived here seemed lonely. She knew something about loneliness. Then she returned to work. What Simone did not know was that from the second-floor landing, Adrian Park had been watching her for nearly a minute. Not because she was remarkable. Not because she stood out. Quite the opposite. For the first time in months, someone had walked through his home without looking at him with pity. And somehow, that simple fact lingered in his mind long after she disappeared from view. By the end of her second week, Simone Brooks had settled into a quiet routine. She arrived before sunrise, worked steadily through the East Wing, shared brief conversations with staff during lunch, and returned home before dark. It was simple, predictable, exactly the kind of work she preferred. Yet there was one thing she could not stop noticing. The mansion seemed to grow quieter whenever Adrian Park appeared. Employees lowered their voices. Hallways emptied. Even the air felt heavier somehow. Simone had only seen him twice from a distance. The first time, he crossed the upper balcony in his wheelchair without looking down. The second time, he passed through the library while she organized shelves. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them needed to. His expression alone seemed to build walls around him. That evening, a storm rolled in from the water. Wind rattled the windows. Rain tapped steadily against the glass. Most of the staff had already gone home, but Simone stayed late to finish inventory reports Evelyn had assigned earlier. By the time she finished, the mansion had fallen almost completely silent. She pulled on her coat and headed toward the front entrance when something caught her attention through the tall windows overlooking the back gardens. At first she thought it was a shadow. Then she realized someone was sitting outside. Simone frowned and moved closer to the glass. Rain drifted through the darkness in silver streaks beneath the garden lights. Near the edge of the stone patio sat Adrian Park. Alone. His wheelchair faced the water. He was not moving. The sight stopped her cold. The temperature had dropped into the low 40s. Wind pushed rain across the property. Yet he remained there, motionless beneath the storm. For a moment, Simone assumed someone would come get him. A security guard. A staff member. Anyone. But several minutes passed. Nobody appeared. Her hand tightened around the strap of her bag. It was not her responsibility. She knew that. The man valued privacy. The staff respected boundaries. But something about the image unsettled her. Maybe it was the loneliness. Maybe it was the way he seemed to have disappeared into the darkness while surrounded by a mansion full of people. With a quiet sigh, Simone turned around and walked toward a nearby storage closet. A few moments later, she stepped outside carrying a thick wool blanket. Cold wind immediately swept across the patio. Rain dampened her hair as she approached carefully. Adrian did not react. His eyes remained fixed on the distant water beyond the property. The waves reflected fragments of light from the shoreline. Simone stopped behind him. For a second, she considered announcing herself. Instead, she gently unfolded the blanket and draped it across his shoulders. The wool settled softly against his coat. Adrian's body stiffened slightly. Simone immediately stepped back. "Sorry," she said quietly. "It is freezing out here." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Rain continued falling around them. "You should not stay out here too long." Her voice carried no judgment, only concern. Adrian remained silent. Simone nodded once, accepting the silence. "Good night, Mr. Park." Then she turned and walked back toward the house. The door closed behind her. What Simone never saw was the slight movement of Adrian's hand as his fingers brushed the edge of the blanket. For months, people had looked at him with sympathy, caution, or obligation. Doctors had monitored him. Employees had obeyed him. Advisors had worried about him. But nobody had simply noticed he was cold. Sitting beneath the storm, Adrian stared out at the dark water while rain tapped softly against the wool resting across his shoulders. And for the first time since the accident, a small crack appeared in the walls he had spent months building around himself. The next morning, Adrian Park found himself looking toward the library windows before he even realized he was doing it. Gray clouds drifted above the water, and pale sunlight filtered through the mist that covered the shoreline. The mansion remained quiet as always, but something felt slightly different. He could not explain it. For months, every day had looked exactly the same. Wake up. Avoid mirrors. Ignore calls. Pretend time was moving. Yet now his attention kept returning to a single thought. The woman who had placed a blanket over his shoulders had expected nothing in return. No conversation. No gratitude. No recognition. She had simply seen someone sitting in the cold and decided to help. The simplicity of it bothered him more than he cared to admit. From his study window, Adrian noticed Simone crossing the courtyard below, carrying cleaning supplies. She moved quickly through the morning air, focused entirely on her work. No hesitation. No performance. She was not trying to impress anyone. His gaze followed her for a moment before he looked away, irritated with himself. People did kind things every day. It meant nothing. At least that was what he told himself. Later that afternoon, Adrian entered the library while Simone was organizing books on the far side of the room. The scent of old paper and polished wood filled the air. Rain tapped softly against the windows. Simone glanced up when she heard the wheelchair. "Good afternoon, Mr. Park." Her tone was calm and natural. Not overly cheerful. Not cautious. Just normal. Adrian paused. Most employees became visibly nervous when speaking to him. Simone simply returned to arranging books. "Good afternoon," he replied. The words felt strangely unfamiliar. He had not initiated small talk in months. Silence settled between them again. Simone continued working. Adrian picked up a book from a nearby table and pretended to read. A few minutes passed. Then another. Finally, Simone stepped back to examine a shelf she had finished organizing. "That looks much better," she murmured to herself. Adrian glanced toward her. "What does?" She smiled slightly. "The symmetry. It was bothering me all week." Adrian looked at the shelves. They appeared exactly the same as before. "You noticed that?" "I notice everything when I clean." She laughed softly. Occupational hazard. Adrian surprised himself by almost smiling. Almost. For the rest of the afternoon, he found his attention drifting toward the sound of her moving around the room. The rustle of pages. The quiet hum of a song he did not recognize. The occasional comment directed at no one in particular. There was something strangely comforting about it. She treated the mansion like a workplace. Not a palace. Not a monument to power. Just a building that needed dusting. More importantly, she treated him the same way. Not as a feared figure. Not as a tragic figure. Simply as another person. Occupying the room. As the day faded into evening, Simone gathered her supplies and prepared to leave. Passing by Adrian's desk, she paused. "You should open those curtains more often." Adrian looked up. "What?" Simone nodded toward the windows. "The view is beautiful. Seems like a shame to hide it." Before he could respond, she offered a small smile and continued toward the door. A moment later, she disappeared down the hallway. Adrian sat motionless. Most people avoided commenting on his habits. Most people tiptoed around his moods. Simone did neither. She spoke honestly without realizing she was doing anything unusual. For several minutes, he stared at the closed curtains covering half the room. Then, almost against his own will, he pressed the control beside his desk. The heavy fabric slowly parted. Late afternoon sunlight spilled across the floor. Golden reflections danced across the water outside. Adrian blinked as brightness filled the room. He had forgotten how beautiful the view was. And for the second time in 2 days, Simone Brooks managed to change something inside the mansion without even trying. The following week brought something the mansion had not experienced in months. Conversation. Not loud conversation. Not dramatic change. Just small moments that slowly filled spaces that had been empty for too long. It started on a Wednesday afternoon. Rain drummed softly against the windows while Simone organized storage boxes in a rarely used sitting room. Adrian happened to be passing through when a photograph slipped from one of the boxes and landed face up on the floor. Simone bent down to pick it up before noticing the image. A younger version of Adrian stood beside an older Korean woman. Both were smiling. Genuine smiles. The kind that came from happiness rather than obligation. Simone carefully handed the photograph to him. "Your mother?" she asked. Adrian looked at the picture for several seconds before answering. "My grandmother." His voice softened almost imperceptibly. "She raised me." Simone nodded. "She looks kind." Adrian studied the photograph again. "She was." The answer surprised even him. Usually he avoided personal conversations. Yet, somehow the words came naturally. Simone smiled. "My father used to have that same look." Adrian glanced up. "Your father?" For a moment, Simone remained quiet. Then she sat on the edge of a nearby chair. Outside, Rain continued tapping against the glass. He spent the last 6 years of his life in a wheelchair. Adrian looked at her carefully. It was the first time she had ever volunteered something personal. A construction accident, she continued. One moment, everything was normal. The next, our entire family had to learn a different life. Adrian listened without interrupting. I was 22, Simone said. Most of my friends were starting careers and traveling. I was helping him get dressed, helping him move around the house, helping him believe life was still worth living. The room grew quiet. Adrian's eyes lowered slightly. He knew exactly how difficult that must have been. That sounds hard. Simone laughed softly. Some days it was. Then her expression grew thoughtful. But do you know what hurt him the most? Adrian shook his head. Not the wheelchair. Not the pain. It was the way people stopped seeing him. Her words settled heavily between them. Everyone looked at what he lost, she continued. Nobody remembered who he still was. Adrian felt something tighten in his chest. Simone was no longer talking about her father. Or perhaps she was talking about both men at the same time. Rain streaked down the windows. The fireplace crackled quietly nearby. What happened? Adrian asked. Simone smiled gently. He kept living anyway. The answer came without hesitation. He gardened. He read books. He annoyed everyone by pretending he knew more than the doctors. Adrian actually laughed. A real laugh. Small but unmistakable. Simone grinned. Trust me. He was stubborn. For the first time in months, Adrian felt himself relaxing. Not because someone pitted him. Not because someone encouraged him. Because someone understood. There was a difference. As the conversation faded, Simone stood and returned to organizing boxes. Adrian remained where he was, staring at the photograph in his hands. For months, he had viewed his life as something broken beyond repair. Yet listening to Simone, he realized she carried scars of her own. She had known loss. She had known responsibility. She had known the exhausting work of helping someone rebuild after everything changed. And somehow, despite all of it, she still moved through the world with kindness. As evening shadows stretched across the room, Adrian carefully placed the photograph back into the box. But this time he did not turn it face down. For the first time since the accident, he found himself wondering whether his story was actually over. And for the first time since Victoria walked away, the future did not seem quite as dark as it once had. 2 weeks later, the first sign of trouble arrived in the form of a black luxury sedan rolling slowly through the front gates just before noon. Simone happened to be arranging fresh flowers in the foyer when she noticed the vehicle through the tall front windows. At first, she paid little attention. Important visitors occasionally came and went. That was normal. What was not normal was the expression on Evelyn's face when she saw who stepped out of the car. The house manager froze for half a second before quietly setting down the clipboard in her hands. Oh no, she murmured. Simone looked toward the entrance as the front door opened. The woman who entered carried herself with effortless confidence. Her tailored cream-colored coat, diamond earrings, and flawless appearance immediately suggested wealth and privilege. Simone recognized her at once from the photographs she had occasionally seen around the mansion before they quietly disappeared. Victoria Sinclair had returned. The air inside the foyer seemed to change instantly. Staff members exchanged nervous glances before finding reasons to leave the area. Victoria removed her sunglasses and smiled politely. It is good to be back. Evelyn offered a professional greeting, but her smile never reached her eyes. Upstairs, Adrian was reviewing documents in the study when Daniel informed him of the unexpected visitor. For several seconds, Adrian simply stared at him. Victoria is here? Daniel nodded carefully. She says she would like to speak with you. Silence settled over the room. Months ago, Adrian would have agreed immediately. Months ago, hearing her name still carried hope. Now the feeling was different. Distant. Almost unfamiliar. Downstairs, Simone continued working while trying to ignore the tension spreading through the house. An hour later, she entered a hallway near the private lounge carrying freshly folded linens. As she approached the partially open door, she heard voices inside. She immediately slowed her steps, intending to leave without interrupting. Then she heard Victoria speaking. Everyone says you are recovering faster than expected. Her voice carried warmth, but something about it felt practiced. Simone paused unintentionally. That is what they tell me, Adrian replied. I was worried about you, Victoria continued. I thought about you constantly. Simone frowned slightly. The words sounded strange. Not because of what Victoria said, but because of how she said it. There was no emotion behind them, only calculation. Then another voice entered the conversation. Daniel's. Interesting timing. The room fell quiet. Daniel rarely spoke without purpose. What is that supposed to mean? Victoria asked. Nothing, Daniel replied calmly. Only that Mr. Park's business recovery has been featured in 3 major financial publications this month. Quite a coincidence. Simone felt her stomach tighten. Suddenly the pieces began fitting together. Adrian's health had improved. His companies were thriving again. Public confidence was returning. And now Victoria had appeared. She quietly stepped away before hearing anything further. Her heart felt unexpectedly heavy. Later that evening, she spotted Adrian sitting alone near the library windows. The sunset painted the water gold beyond the glass. For the first time, he looked uncertain. Not broken, not defeated, just thoughtful. Simone wanted to say something. To warn him. To tell him what she had heard hiding beneath Victoria's carefully chosen words. But she remained silent. Instead, she simply looked toward the water and hoped Adrian could see what had become painfully obvious to everyone else. Some people return because they love you. Others return because they miss what you can give them. And deep down, Simone feared Victoria belonged to the second group. 3 days later, Adrian requested that a small dinner be arranged in the mansion's private dining room. The invitation list was surprisingly short. Daniel would attend. Evelyn would attend. Victoria would attend. Nothing more. The evening arrived beneath a clear winter sky. Candlelight reflected across polished wood while soft jazz played quietly through hidden speakers. To an outsider, it looked like a simple gathering. In reality, Adrian was searching for answers. Victoria arrived wearing a navy designer dress and the confident smile that had once convinced him she would remain by his side forever. Throughout dinner, she spoke frequently about the future. She mentioned travel, charity events, business opportunities, public appearances they could attend together. She painted a picture of the life they might rebuild. Yet something felt different now. Months earlier, Adrian would have listened with hope. Tonight, he listened with clarity. Across the room, Simone quietly refreshed water glasses and cleared finished plates. She kept her attention on her work, never interrupting, never drawing attention to herself. More than once, Adrian noticed Victoria watching him only when business was mentioned. Whenever conversation drifted toward his recovery, his struggles, or the difficult months after the accident, her interest faded almost immediately. Then came the moment that changed everything. Daniel casually mentioned an upcoming expansion project that had recently increased the value of several company holdings. Victoria's eyes lit up. That is incredible news, she said immediately. I always knew you would come back stronger than ever. Adrian remained silent. Daniel continued. Of course there are risks. Nothing is guaranteed. Victoria waved away the concern. With Adrian leading things again, success is inevitable. For the first time that evening, Adrian asked a direct question. What if none of it had recovered? The room grew quiet. Victoria blinked. What do you mean? What if the companies continued declining? What if my health never improved? What if I spent the rest of my life exactly as I was 6 months ago? The question hung in the air. Victoria hesitated. Only for a second, but it was enough. That is not what happened, she answered carefully. Adrian nodded slowly. He had his answer. Across the room, Simone lowered her eyes. She felt no satisfaction, only sadness. The silence that followed revealed more than any argument ever could. Later that night, after the guests departed, Adrian sat alone beside the library windows. The moon reflected across the dark water beyond the glass. Simone entered briefly to collect a forgotten serving tray. As she turned to leave, Adrian spoke. You once told me that people stop seeing who someone is. Simone paused. Sometimes they do. Adrian looked out toward the shoreline lights in the distance. Tonight, I realized something. What is that? She asked softly. A faint smile appeared on his face. The people who truly care about you never need success to recognize your value. Simone said nothing. She did not need to. Because for the first time since the accident, Adrian Park could finally see the difference between someone who loved the life he provided and someone who simply cared whether he was cold. Winter slowly gave way to spring. The gray skies that had hung over the water for months began surrendering to sunlight, and with each passing week, the mansion felt less like a place frozen in grief and more like a home finding its heartbeat again. The change was subtle at first. Curtains stayed open, Meetings resumed. Laughter occasionally drifted through hallways that had once echoed with silence. But the greatest change was Adrian Park himself. One bright Saturday morning, sunlight spilled across the garden paths as workers trimmed hedges and prepared flower beds for the season. Simone was organizing supplies near the greenhouse when she noticed Adrian approaching. He moved carefully, supported by a cane instead of a wheelchair. The distance was not far, perhaps 30 feet, but she immediately recognized the significance. Months earlier, such a walk would have seemed impossible. Adrian stopped beside her and looked out toward the water. The breeze carried the scent of fresh grass and blooming flowers. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Comfortable silence had become something they shared often. Finally, Adrian reached into his coat pocket and removed a small velvet box. Simone looked at it with confusion. Her eyes widened slightly as he placed it gently in her hands. "Mr. Park." Adrian smiled. "Open it." Inside rested the same diamond engagement ring that had once represented a future that never arrived. Simone immediately looked up. "I cannot accept this." "It is not what you think," Adrian said softly. Relief mixed with curiosity across her face. Adrian gazed toward the water before continuing. "For months after the accident, I thought that ring represented everything I had lost." His voice remained calm. "Then I realized it represented something else. A lesson." Simone listened quietly. "It taught me that some people love success. Some people love appearances. Some people love comfort." He paused. "But very few people care about the person underneath all of it." The breeze rustled the trees around them. Sunlight reflected across the bay beyond the property. "You stayed kind when there was nothing to gain," Adrian continued. "You treated me like a human being when everyone else either feared me or pitied me. You reminded me that my life was not over." Simone's eyes glistened. "I did not do anything special." Adrian laughed softly. "That is exactly why it mattered." He gently closed her fingers around the velvet box. "Keep it." Simone looked confused. "Why?" "Because every time I see it, I remember who left." His smile grew warmer. "And every time you see it, I hope you remember who stayed." For several seconds, neither of them spoke. The garden seemed brighter somehow. The water calmer. The future closer. Later that afternoon, staff members watched from the mansion windows as Adrian continued walking through the gardens. Slowly, carefully, but independently. Simone remained nearby, talking with him as they followed the stone pathway toward the shoreline. There was no grand declaration, no dramatic ending. Only two people moving forward after helping each other heal. The scars remained. The difficult memories remained. But so did hope. And as sunlight danced across the water and the wind carried the first true warmth of spring, Adrian Park realized that the most important person to enter his life had arrived only after everything else had fallen apart. And that day, he finally understood that healing does not begin when pain disappears. It begins when someone reminds you that you are still worth caring about.